My name is Kevin Berger, and I am the author of Atheism is Untenable. On this channel, I don't engage in apologetics. Instead, I apply the principles of polemics and skepticism to atheism and the claims made by atheists. This is Justified Nonetheless. Please like, share, subscribe, and turn on those notifications.
Hey, what's up, my tumbleweeds? In my previous videos on Jesus mythicism, I briefly touched on the Ferrer hypothesis, something on which many mythicists hang their hats routinely. This hypothesis is something that is presented as a resolution to the synoptic problem. But what is the synoptic problem? I'm glad you asked. The synoptic problem is a technical term for a specific issue, that being why Matthew, Mark, and Luke have so many similarities. For example, the stories that they relate, their sequence, and the phrasings used, often being word for word. One hypothesis is the existence of other prior source, for instance, the Q source, named for the word quell, which is German for, of all things, source. This other source might be some manuscript or an oral tradition, who knows? The important things to remember are, 1, that it's a hypothesis, not an established fact, and 2, that the fact that we do not have an extant manuscript does not imply a fabrication because A, it isn't being asserted as fact, and B, this precludes the aforementioned possibility of an oral source without warrant. In 1955, Austin Ferrer presented another hypothesis as a means by which to resolve the synoptic problem, wherein he posits that Mark was the first gospel written and that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source, thus eliminating the reliance on a Q source. The theory of Markan priority similarly suggests that Mark is the earliest written gospel, serving as the foundation for the narratives in Matthew and Luke. While these theories are frameworks that offer some understanding for the textual connections between the gospels, they are often accepted and presumed as established fact. They are not fact. They, like Q, are hypotheses. The Ferrer hypothesis seemingly enjoys the advantage of simplicity as it provides an explanation for the similarities in the Gospel without the reliance on an additional source. However, I contend that this perceived advantage is illusory because while this hypothesis does offer explanatory power for the similarities, it instead introduces a new problem with regards to their differences. This has led to some scholars to explain variations among the Gospels as intentional alterations motivated by each author's unique theological agenda. However, interpreting Gospel variations solely through the lens of theological motivation risk logical and methodological issues. Number 1, appeal to motive. One common approach to Gospel variations is to attribute them to theological motives of each author. For example, discrepancies between Mark and Matthew's portrayals of Jesus may be interpreted as Matthew is deliberately shaping his account to emphasize Jewish messianic themes. This interpretive move, however, can fall into the appeal of motive fallacy, where we assume the author's intention without any direct evidence that theological motives drove the alteration. Without concrete support, this reasoning relies on assumed cause, the author's theological intent to explain observed variations. Relying on the appeal to motive fallacy has significant consequences for gospel studies. It diverts attention from other plausible explanations, such as regional oral traditions, diverse sources, or independent memories of events. By assuming theological motives as the primary driver of changes, scholars may overlook a more nuanced understanding of how these texts developed in complex and varied historical contexts. 2. Begging the question. Closely related to the appeal to motive, begging the question is another fallacy in these interpretations. Begging the question involves assuming the truth of the very point in question, in this case assuming from the outset that theological motives guided the gospel authors modifying Mark. This leads to circular reasoning. Scholars begin by assuming theological motives and then interpret every variation as evidence of these motives, treating the variations themselves as proof that the author was motivated by the theology. This approach restricts open inquiry and prevents scholars from following the evidence where it leads naturally. Instead of starting with variations as data points to be explained, scholars begin with the conclusion, the theological motive, and interpret variations as verification of that conclusion. A more rigorous methodology would require us to first investigate whether other motivations, such as fidelity to alternative sources, better explain these changes. 3. Fallacy of presumption. A third issue arises from the fallacy of presumption, wherein an interpretive framework is accepted without adequate support, in this case assuming that theological tailoring as the default explanation for gospel differences lacks empirical substantiation within the texts themselves. This presumption bypasses the need to rigorously explore why each gospel author might have varied details or narrative order. The presumption of theological motive can lead to overlooking simpler evidence-based explanations, such as incidental variations due to memory limitations, regional traditions, or access to distinct sources. A more disciplined approach would prioritize a careful examination of alternative sources contributing to textual differences before settling on theological motives as the primary explanation. 4. Affirming the consequent. This approach also risks the fallacy of affirming the consequent, which occurs when scholars assume that the observed variations necessarily indicate theological motives. The structure of this reasoning can be summarized as follows. Premise 1. If the gospel authors change Mark's narrative to reflect their theological motives, we would expect to see variations between the texts. Premise 2. We observe variations. Conclusion. Therefore, the authors must have theological motives. This logic is flawed because other potential causes for these variations exist, such as different sources, diverse oral traditions, or unintentional differences due to individual recollections or regional perspectives. By affirming the consequent, this interpretive framework prematurely concludes that theological motives are the cause of variations, disregarding the possibility of other explanations. 5. Argument by assertion. Finally, interpretations that rely on the Ferrer hypothesis or Markan priority often make an argument by assertion, presenting these theories as indisputable facts. By repeatedly asserting the Ferrer hypothesis as objective reality, scholars may inadvertently overlook alternative models or explanations, or the relationship between the synoptic gospels, such as the two-source hypothesis, or the possibility of other independent sources. This can lead to a form of confirmation bias, where evidence is selectively interpreted to fit a predetermined framework independent of critical explanations. By treating these theories as settled fact, argument by assertion limits the scope of inquiry and risks reducing gospel traditions to a single linear narrative without exploring the complexity of their development. Recognizing these hypotheses are still theories, not definitive truths, opens the door to broader investigations that could incorporate oral, regional, and traditional sources alongside literary analysis. This, of course, doesn't even take into consideration differences between the texts that do not even pertain to theological motivations, which is what leads me to what I call the Criterion of Unnecessary Variation. This is distinct from the Criterion of Embarrassment, which is the type of biblical historical analysis in which a historical account is deemed to be more likely to be true if the author would have no reason to invent a historical account which might embarrass them. It's also different from the criteria of multiple attestation, dissimilarity, coherence, and other criteria. The idea here is there is simply no explanation to intentionally include a contradictory detail that serves no purpose. This is particularly true if one desires to be believed. For example, the narrative used to get from Nazareth to Bethlehem by way of a census that never occurred serves no theological purpose for a fictitious person. When presented with this problem, Godless Engineer sidesteps the issue altogether by focusing on the fact that according to his line of argumentation, which isn't substantiated by evidence, mind you, and is only asserted, they, whoever they are, comb through the existing scriptures to explain the life story of the Messiah, reinterpreting parts of prophecy that were not prophetic. The problems are that 1, whether or not the passage in question was prophetic or not doesn't matter because it doesn't exist at all, and 2, whether the passage was prophetic or not doesn't matter because his argument is that Jesus of Nazareth never existed as a historic person at all either. Thus, his entire response is a red herring that dismisses the objection without even engaged with its content.
It's interesting that you say that Jesus needs to be from both places. In fact, if we look at the original gospel, which is the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is called a Nazarene, and not that he's from Nazareth. But it's a kind of a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation from the Old Testament that he needs to be from Nazareth because of the branch of Jesse and everything like that. In fact, the Gospel of Mark seems to indicate that Jesus, at least the Jesus depicted in Mark, more than likely came from Capernaum and not like Nazareth or Bethlehem. Bethlehem doesn't come into the picture until much later in the Gospel story, in the Gospel timeline. So this is the Hitchens response to mythicism, I guess. So basically what you have is these first century Jewish Christians. They were scrounging the Hebrew Bible, like the Septuagint, for prophecies about the Messiah. And so what they were doing was they were creating pesherums where they would reinterpret Old Testament scriptures and create this new information about the Messiah, because they thought that God was giving them the secret information that was encoded into the Old Testament, or the Septuagint at the time. And so they were reinterpreting these things, and so they basically reinterpreted a few things that they had to twist into getting some kind of idea about. And so like the Nazareth and the Bethlehem thing is an example. They got the Nazareth thing from the root of Jesse. I can't remember which one that is, but then there's Bethlehem, which seems to go back to another passage that claims that that Jesus would be from the birthplace of David, or David's hometown and everything, right? And so what you have are these Jewish rabbis that were eventually going to be Christians. They were just reinterpreting these Old Testament passages to be about Jesus when it wasn't originally about Jesus at all.
That's just one example of passages within the Synoptic Gospels that cannot be attributed to theological motivations. Here are some others. The genealogy of Jesus. Matthew 1 through 16 and Luke 3:23 through 38 provide conflicting genealogies for Jesus. 2. The visit of the Magi versus the shepherds. Matthew 2:1 through 12 describes the visit of the Magi, wise men, who follow a star to find Jesus, while Luke 2:8 through 20 describes the shepherds receiving a message from angels and visiting the newborn Jesus. These two accounts offer completely different visitors and circumstances surrounding Jesus' birth. Number 3, the death of Judas Iscariot. Matthew 27:3 through 10 describes Judas as feeling remorseful for his betrayal of Jesus and returning the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priest before hanging himself. The chief priest then used the silver to buy a potter's field, which becomes known as the field of blood because it was paid for with blood money. Acts 1:18 describes a different account. Judas buys the field himself with the silver, then falls and bursts open, leading to it being called the field of blood because of the literal bloodshed related to his betrayal. Number 4, the resurrection accounts. A, the number of women at the tomb. Matthew 28:1 mentions Mary Magdalene and the other Mary as the only women at the tomb, while Mark 16:1 lists Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Shalom, and Luke 24:10 adds Joanna to the group. B, the angels at the tomb. Matthew 28:2 through 7. There is one angel who speaks to the women, while Luke 24:4 mentions 2 angels. In Mark 16:5, a young man, often interpreted as an angel, is at the tomb. The discrepancies in the number of angels or messengers at the tomb further complicate the resurrection narrative. See the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. In Matthew 28:16 through 20, the resurrected Jesus appears to the disciples on the mountain of Galilee and gives the Great Commission. Luke 24:36 through 53 describes Jesus appearing to the disciples in Jerusalem, where he eats with them and commissions them to preach repentance. John 20:19 through 29 places Jesus' appearance in Jerusalem as well, but describes a more intimate interaction with Thomas, who doubts and later believes. The varying locations and details of the resurrection complicate the narrative and suggest different traditions or editorial choices. The details outlined above represent just a few of the many discrepancies and tensions found between the gospel accounts. Some of these variations couldn't be attributed to theological motives, but often others, particularly those related to the historical events, suggest that gospel writers were working with different sources, traditions, and interpretive frameworks. In many cases, the tensions cannot be easily explained away, which poses a challenge to those who attempt to harmonize the gospels into a single historical accurate account. So, how can we conclude from this? What can we get from this? The Ferrer hypothesis and market priority have provided influential frameworks for understanding gospel relationships, interpreting gospel variations as theologically motivated alterations presumes several logical pitfalls: appeal to motive, begging the question, presumption, affirming the consequent, and an argument by assertion each contribute to an overly narrow interpretation of the gospel, and the fact that even with such presumptions of theological motivations, we still have some divergent details that are insufficiently explained. And most importantly, it's still just a hypothesis.